Welcome, everybody, to the Radical Moderate Podcast. I'm your host, Pat O'Brien, and today we are going to be talking about something that I think about a lot, and I believe that there's a lot of solutions out there that haven't really been explored yet, and that topic is legal immigration. And I want to emphasize, underline, put in bold the word legal immigration. So the focus today is not illegal immigration, which I think gets a lot of attention in the media and other places, but I don't think that the topic of legal immigration does. So today I have a guest, and his name is John Yates. John is an attorney who spent many years in the field of immigration. And John, welcome to the show. And if you would, tell the audience your background. Tell them why you would be qualified to impart knowledge about legal immigration.
Thanks for having me, Pat. This is great. I worked in politics and government for 8.5 years and then went into private law practice, and worked in a law firm for 6 years. During that time, I built an immigration law practice in my firm. And then after that period of time, I was invited to work in-house in a corporate environment. And so now I work for a corporate client, and I continue to do immigration work for my corporate client.
How broad is your experience? Meaning, like, how many states, how many different kind of courts, and then just how does even all of that work? Where does an attorney go when they're helping a client?
So when I started private practice, I thought I would take an interest in immigration law and maybe start doing some of that type of work. And I was surprised just how much work there was in Little Rock, Arkansas, or working from Little Rock, Arkansas, to do immigration law. So at some point, I thought, well, I'm encountering a lot of people from a lot of different countries. And I started keeping track of how many countries the people that I was working with had come from. And when I finished private practice, I had worked with people from more than 63 countries.
That's a lot. What about how many continents? Did anybody from Antarctica?
I lost track of the continents. I think it's probably 5. I don't know that I had anybody. Maybe it was 6. That I didn't have anybody from Antarctica, but I did have somebody from Australia. So.
Is it fair to say, though, that you had clients from pretty much across the globe?
I did. I had a wide variety, and I had a wide variety of clients in terms of the type of work. I did employment-based work. I did family-based work. I did asylum. I had some diversity visa clients. So we'll talk about some of that. But I had a wide range of opportunities to work in immigration.
All right. Well, before we delve into kind of the policy part of legal immigration, I think what they would say in a court of law, and of course I'm an attorney also, but not at all an immigration attorney, never had a case like that. I think a judge would qualify you at this point to speak as an expert witness.
I hope so.
So hopefully my listeners can pick up something from you today. So I want to keep it a little broad at first here. So you've got this experience. I think you said 63 countries. Before we go into the various categories, give me a sense of the kind of clients that you were encountered. How did they find you? What were they trying to accomplish when they first reached out to you?
So it's interesting because the driver for people coming to get a lawyer was both from the individual who's the immigrant, as well as the employer or sponsor, sometimes a family member, sometimes a religious organization that maybe was employing or wanting to employ an immigrant. And I speak Spanish, so that gave me an edge in terms of people who needed a Spanish-speaking lawyer, and I had the opportunity to practice my Spanish pretty regularly in my practice. And the employers would come and say, I want to sponsor somebody. Can you help me figure out how I can do this? Sometimes the individual would come, and so then we would talk through what the options were and how to go about it.
All right. Well, let's dive in now. I'm going to kind of set the table a little bit. My research shows that, and I'm going to use the word naturalization. It's simply the word used in the U.S. Constitution, and my understanding of it anyways, is that means when a person who was not originally a U.S. citizen now becomes a U.S. citizen, I believe they get to vote, they get to live here. So that, I think, is a much different category than some of the other ones we might talk about today. But my research shows that somewhere between, in the last couple of years anyways, about 800 to 900,000 people per year legally naturalized to the United States. Does that sound about right?
Yes, I think that's accurate.
Okay. And I don't know, when I looked at that number, I didn't know if I thought that was low or high, or just sounds about right. But again, just talking about legal immigration, we're not talking about situations where somebody has illegally crossed the border. At the moment, we're not even talking about asylum, right? That's just a different thing.
It is different, yes.
Okay, we'll get into that later. So how does this start? Like, that's the end part where I think I've been to one of these ceremonies before. There was about 20 people there. They've passed some tests. They pledge allegiance. Like, it's a great feeling. But that's the very end of the road. Where does it start? What are the categories? Like, give us some insight here.
So I'll just say that if anybody has an opportunity to attend a naturalization ceremony, it's a really cool thing. When I was in private practice, I had clients that eventually got naturalized and invited me to come. I took my daughter, and she still talks about it today, about how meaningful it was to see people who've been on a very long path, as we'll talk about in a moment, to finally get to the culmination of that. But in terms of talking about illegal immigration, you often hear people say, well, why don't they just become citizens? Why don't they just apply to be citizens?
Absolutely.
And the reality is that a lot of them would like to, and it's a very, very long road. So in order to get to that end state of being a citizen, you generally have to have a sponsor. There's other opportunities, other ways of going about it, but employment-based immigration or family-based immigration are the two main paths, and we can talk in more detail about those.
And so let's start with family. Are you saying that this is a situation where they already have family here?
Right. Generally, you've got a U.S. citizen who's sponsoring someone to come to the country, or who's already in the country to become a green card holder. And that's the first part of becoming a citizen, is you first have to be a permanent resident. Permanent resident and green card holder are the same thing. We just use different terminology. At one point, the cards were green, and so they got that name, and it stuck. But you had to be a permanent resident for either 3 or 5 years, depending on what path you're going through. The spouses of citizens can do it in 3 to become a citizen, but most people, it takes 5 years being a permanent resident or a green card holder before you can even apply for citizenship.
And I've heard the term chain migration. Is that connected in any way to family?
Right. Generally, that refers to family members who come here and then they want to bring more family members, or they have family members who have been in the U.S. and sponsor them, and then they in turn sponsor additional family members. So you may have someone who comes here to work and their spouse stays in their home country. They, after getting to the point where they decide to bring their spouse here. They may have children. They were not born in the U.S. They come eventually, and then they have extended family members, siblings, brothers and sisters, who could be sponsored for immigration.
So I want to come back to the time element in a second, but before we do that, let's say that you got a person and it's a husband and wife and then children. I think everybody gets that pretty clearly. But then somebody's got a cousin who says, hey, I want to come to the U.S., whether they're from Mexico or Honduras or someplace in Africa. Is it automatic that cousin can just use that connection? Or how does that, what does it mean, or what's the special status just because you have a family connection?
Right. So there are different categories within the family-based immigration system. And it's basically the immediate family members that we're talking about: spouses, siblings, children, parents. That's pretty much the relationships that qualify. And there's different categories depending on the relationship and depending on whether the sponsor is a citizen or if they are a permanent resident. Permanent residents can also sponsor people to come to the U.S., and then they go in a different category.
Okay. And I feel like this area is probably going to be the easiest one because it makes the most sense. So, your family, yeah, you've been here, and make sure we're being clear. So you're talking about, let's say, I guess it could be a lot of situations, but you've got a man and he marries someone who's not a citizen.
Right.
And that's very logical that can, that he can bring her here. But then, or maybe somehow he's here for whatever reason, and he had a spouse who never came here for whatever reason. That makes a lot of sense. So that part I think is pretty straightforward. But what were your cases like? How did these things start? And then I want to get into the time element. Let's explain, and we're just sticking with family. How long does this take typically?
Sure. So, in terms of the cases, you may have someone who's come to the U.S. to work and they meet and fall in love with an American citizen and they decide to get married. And then that citizen says, I want the person to stay. We're going to live here. I want them to stay and be able to have indefinite residence here. So they sponsor them. You may also have people who meet online. And it was interesting to me when it's been years now since I was in private practice, but at that time, it was already happening that people met online and some of them were outside the country, and then they meet in person and they want to eventually decide they want to marry. And so the citizen is sponsoring the person to come into the country from outside the United States. And those are some of the types of ways. Of course, the other relationships with siblings, parents, children, that's also, the natural course of family life.
The online thing, I just recently saw some study that was basically 80% of people who are now married met online. That sounded high to me, but I know it's a lot higher than when I was young. That makes me think of something that we'll probably touch on here in a minute, which is you could see a possibility for fraud there if you don't go through the right steps. But let's say that it's a little bit more traditional, and I wasn't thinking, and you brought to light, someone's working here, maybe they're on a visa or something, they're a student, who knows. They meet someone, they fall in love, they get married. Let's use that situation. How long does that person, the person who's trying to become naturalized, what's a typical flow for them, and how long from the time do they got to get married first, or do they announce their intention? How does it work?
Well, there is a fiancé visa, but we won't go into that for the purposes of this immediate discussion. So in terms of a spouse, they get married, and they can get married outside the U.S. or in the U.S., but it has to be a legal marriage. They provide that documentation in their paperwork when they send it in. And when it's a spouse of a U.S. citizen, it's kind of what I used to call the most preferred category of immigrant under our system. So you can submit all of the paperwork at one time, and then the Immigration Service eventually gets to reviewing that and processing it. And they have a couple of things to decide. One, is this a relationship that qualifies under the immigration law? So is it a spouse of a U.S. citizen, which clearly qualifies? And they have to look at the marriage certificate and validate all that. And then they're looking at whether the person who's immigrating is eligible to immigrate. Do they have a criminal history? Have they had any other immigration issues that might disqualify them from becoming a permanent resident? Because what we're talking about first is the person becoming a permanent resident, or as I said earlier, a green card holder. And so that paperwork works its way through the Immigration Service, and eventually there's an interview with an immigration officer. And they are going to determine, is this a legitimate marriage, or did somebody just decide to do immigration fraud and say that they were married when they really weren't?
Yeah, if the online thing, I could see how that could be, you could have some potential for fraud there. It seems pretty straightforward. And I guess one of the things I'm picking up on is when you say green card, that person's not a naturalized citizen yet.
Right.
But they're headed that way. It's like an indication you're going to get there. And so if you're married, I think your first thing is you just want your spouse to be with you.
Sure.
And the natural.
Most do. Some
I do, for the record, in case my wife is listening. But I think most people, that's the goal, is they just want to be with them. So the naturalization, while important, probably isn't the key thing. From a standpoint of the pie, if you will, it was my understanding that the family-based sponsorship is the majority, if not 2/3 majority, of how people legally come here. Is that accurate?
That sounds about right. I think there are roughly 1 million people who get a green card each year, depending on the year that you look at. And that's all people who are applying. So that's the family-based and employment-based, as well as some other miscellaneous categories. And I think it's 60 to 65% family-based that makes up that number.
All right. So far, this doesn't sound too terrible, and it makes a lot of sense. I don't think you have to be an immigration attorney to say it just makes sense to have your spouse, your children, your parents here. Let's go to a different category, which I think is the one where I think there's less clarity, and that's kind of the employment based. And I know that you did a lot of like engineer, whether it's software type folks, but I'm sure you're familiar with all of them. Let's go now into, I guess, do you call it employment-based sponsorship or what do we call it?
Right. Yeah, that's the best way to summarize it.
All right. Give us some examples of how that works.
So the first thing is you have to have a sponsor. So in most cases, there are some limited categories where someone can make an investment and get an employment-based green card. But that requires a lot of money and is not very common. So let's just stay on the main categories. The main ones, you have to have a sponsor, and that is a long process for both the sponsor, the employer, and the employee, and usually involves 3 different steps.
Yeah. What are those steps?
So the first thing is the employer has to show that there are not U.S. workers available for the job. And that's done by what's called a labor certification application. So the employer has to show we can't find people, and these days they still make them advertise in the newspaper and do things that
probably a paper newspaper,
right? Probably aren't
with that
modern times, but you advertise to say, you mentioned, I think, software engineer. I've got a software engineer position and I need someone to fill this job. And the truth is they may already have someone in the job. Most of the times they do, because you're not going to sponsor someone for a green card if you don't even know them. But they advertise to test the labor market to say, is there someone who can do this job? We're going to pay X to Y amount. And then they wait for those applications and have to document all of this, usually with the help of an attorney, but sometimes people try it on their own. And then once that process is completed, they submit it to the U.S. Department of Labor. We're still at step 1 out of 3.
Okay. And I could probably ask you some follow-ups there, but before I do, let's go to step 2.
So step 2, once the labor certification application is approved, and we should talk about the timeframes, but the second step is they take that and file with the U.S. Immigration Service. U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services is the official name, USCIS. They file there and say, I'm petitioning for this foreign worker to fill this position, and here's my labor certification from the Department of Labor that shows I've tested the labor market. There aren't sufficient U.S. workers. And now I want you to categorize this person under these different employment-based visa categories to say they're eligible to have a green card and work here indefinitely.
Okay. I am going to kind of break this down a little bit more because I'm assuming, but really wondering, let's use the software engineer example. Is this a person who maybe went to college in the United States and had a student visa and got hired but now the student visa is ending and they got to figure something out, or is it something different?
That's a common path. There are various types of professionals, software engineer and lots of others, who have come to study in the U.S. They came on a student visa, and then after their studies end, their student visa will end, and they have a year after their graduation to work before they have to get a different visa category. And so they, during that year, will have a sponsor that will apply, usually for an H-1B visa. Sometimes that's in the news a fair amount, but H-1B is the most common professional visa, and that gives them 6 years to work on the H-1B, but that's a temporary visa. And during
it's not a green card. It's not a path to citizenship.
That's right. It's not a green card. If you did nothing else after getting your H-1B, you would have to leave after 6 years because that's a temporary visa. So it's unique in some ways in that you can both be working temporarily the 6 years and intending to stay permanently. In some categories of visas, you can't have the intent to stay permanently if you're using that visa. But in the H-1B, you can. You can intend to stay permanently. So during the 6 years, the employer usually will sponsor the person for a green card and start this 3-step process that I talked about.
So far, it doesn't sound terrible. There's timelines, but you're also, the person's getting to stay here. So I think we're under the 3rd step.
Well, no, I guess we could be out of the 3rd step, but let me go back to the 1st step and talk about how long that takes. It varies with the government processing times, but it's around 500 days just to get an answer to the 1st step. So employer does all this preparatory work, which can take several months, usually 6 to 8 months, to do all the advertising and get all that submitted. And then they wait 500 days, let's call it a year and a half, to get the answer back before they can go on to step 2. You can't go to step 2 until step 1 is approved.
Okay.
So then they're a year and a half, 2 years in probably at this point. Then they apply in the 2nd step with the immigrant visa petition. And that's a couple of years, usually at least a year, maybe 2 to get that back.
Okay. So if you're adding those up, is it fair to say steps 1 and 2, probably at least 3 years?
Yes, that's fair.
Now, and just before we go to, I guess you said we're getting ready to go to step 3, but the part I'm having a hard time with is I'm an employer. I need an employee, right? And I'm in the fast food industry. So like when we need an employee, we need them now. We need them today. We need them next week, so very soon. I'm sure you can wait a little longer in a professional setting. I'm not sure. I'm guessing. But 3 years, that seems problematic. Am I missing something? Like that timeline seems pretty long.
It is long. And that's really the driver for a lot of the immigration workarounds or illegal immigration is that the process takes so long to do it legally. And if someone's outside the U.S., that's probably rare that an employment-based process would start with this person outside the U.S. because the employer wants to know who they're hiring. But that can be really problematic if you have to wait that long for someone to be able to come in and take the job.
And then what is step 3 now?
So step 3 is what we officially call the adjustment of status application. That's the application for the green card. And when it says adjust status, it means adjusting the status of the person from something else to a green card, to a permanent resident. And the order in which that can happen is dependent on the category, the employment-based category in this instance that we're talking about. And there are different limits on different categories based on the law. The statute has a cap overall for the number of employment-based green cards that can be given each year. And then under that cap, there are different divisions within the categories. So someone who has a master's degree is in a different category than someone with a bachelor's degree. And the job has to require a bachelor or a master's in order to meet those different category requirements.
And then, and I'm not sure if this is the part or to bring it up or not, but there's caps on where you can come from, right? Like, I mean, it's not unlimited anywhere, or how does that work?
No one country can have more than 7% of the numbers. And so you have some countries with very high immigration, India, China, Mexico are examples where the number of people coming in is hitting that 7% number, exceeding that number. And so that then means that there are separate limits for those countries.
So let's say it's easy to kind of use, I think, India as an example. I don't know if it's medical field or engineers, but let's just use India. So if there's a cap, and I think you were talking about just steps 1 and 2 is about 3 years, but if there's a cap, does that mean there's a waiting list?
That's right. So you get through the first couple of steps, you get categorized as, let's say it's an EB3. That's just one of the labels for the categories. Then you have to look and see, okay, for EB3 and I'm from India, what is the wait time? And the the government publishes what's called the Visa Bulletin, and that shows the order of the people who are waiting in line for a green card. And so it may be that today the government is working on the applications for people who started in 2021 or 2019.
All right. So is it fair to say it could add a year or two, the wait list could, or even more?
Yes, it can be a really long wait in some categories, depending on the country and the category. So people have to know where they stand, and the sooner they start the process, the earlier they're placed in line. But they still have a very long wait in line usually.
And then, so let's say, give us a best case, worst case of a software engineer from India who's trying to fully, from the moment they apply, start the process, labor certification, I think is what you called it, to when they could actually be naturalized. Give us a best case, worst case of those timeframes.
Yeah, we're probably looking, and I haven't looked at the Visa Bulletin specifically for India lately, but let's say probably at least 5 years. That's probably the minimum from the start time until they actually get the green card.
And a green card's not naturalization. A green card just says you can stay here.
That's right. Okay, you can stay more or less indefinitely. Permanent residence is what we call it. And so that means you can stay and live and work, and you don't have to become a citizen. You can,
okay,
but you don't have to. But if you want to become a citizen, you have to be a permanent resident for 5 years before you can even apply for citizenship.
So so in that scenario, if voting was a big deal to you, then under that situation, it would take them from the time they started to the time they're going to be eligible to vote is going to be a decade.
Yes, at a minimum, I would say.
At a minimum. And then that was the best case?
Yes.
What's the worst case?
So, I mean, there are people who end up waiting 9-10 years in a professional setting, depending on the country and the category, to get their green card.
Yeah. As a business person, that's not good. I mean, it doesn't even make any sense. If you said 9 or 10 months, I'd say, that's a long time, but 9 or 10 years doesn't make sense. With the time in this episode, I'd like to delve into the same discussion, but a different category. So we've been talking about, I think, kind of professionals, skilled people, software engineers, maybe medical. I think that the person out there who, like, I'll just say that I've seen in the communities the most are when I'm driving by new construction and I'm looking up and I'm seeing people who don't look like they were born in the place that I was born. And they're speaking a different language and this sort of thing. And they're roofers and they're sheetrockers and I see these people, it's 100-degree heat. And I think to myself, I don't want to do that. But I see these people. So I want to give you a quick example and just take maybe 2 minutes, if you will, to kind of tell me how this would work. Let's say that you got a guy, just generically call him Jose. He lives in Mexico City. He's a highly skilled craftsman, meaning he can roof, he can sheetrock. He'd be the person that if you were an American construction company, you'd be happy to have this guy. But doesn't have family here. Okay, so let's take that out of the equation. He doesn't even necessarily know someone here, but he could get on the internet and see an Indeed ad from ABC Construction. But he's just sitting in Mexico City. Break down for me, how would he legally, because we know how he could illegally get here, how would he legally get in the United States and take that job?
Yeah, so he has to find an employer, as you said.
Let's assume an employer's like, yeah, I'll take a chance on you.
Right. So he gets a sponsor. That sponsor then starts the process I was describing earlier, where they say, we need workers in this particular trade or this particular job. We can't find enough people, and so we're going to advertise this job, and then we're going to submit all of this to the Department of Labor and say, we need workers for this job, and we want to have approval to sponsor someone to come in. So that's step number one. They then wait their year and a half. I called it 500 days earlier. And then once they get that back, they then can submit a petition to the Immigration Service and get him classified in one of those categories I was talking about earlier. We'd probably be talking about EB3 in the employment-based category. And then they wait for the Immigration Service to go through that and review and approve that. And so we're 2 or 3 years down the road minimum And let's say that they get it approved. They've got a good lawyer who helps them work through the process, and they get it approved. Then Jose is going to go to the U.S. consulate in Mexico and apply for an immigrant visa. It's the same thing as what I was calling adjustment of status earlier, but it's not called adjustment of status if you're outside the U.S. It's called an immigrant visa. So he applies for an immigrant visa. He goes through all of that. The only way he can do that is if his place in line has come up when I was talking earlier. And so if you're from Mexico and you're not in the highest skilled category, you're probably looking at 8-10 years to wait just for your place in line to come up.
Okay. I think I get the picture. I mean, so by this time, the construction company may have gone out of business.
May have.
Okay.
But, you said he didn't have any family here. Let's just say hypothetically he did have a sibling.
Well, and let me say this. We're going to have to come back to that on our next episode because I feel like we're just, John, I feel like we're just scratching the surface here. So let's do this. We're going to call this part one of the long discussion on legal immigration with John Yates. Please come back next week. But for this week, thank you for listening. And that's the Radical Moderate podcast. And that's the POV from POB.